November 3, 1984, and the small Vermont town of Williston was preparing for the approaching winter with leaves already fallen and temperatures dropping to the low 40s during the late afternoon hours. Maple Ridge Elementary School had dismissed students at 3:15 p.m. that Saturday after a special weekend art fair, where families had come to see children's paintings and crafts displayed in the gymnasium. Hannah Cole was 6 years old, a first grader with straight blonde hair cut into a bob, wide blue eyes, and a shy demeanor that made teachers describe her as sweet but quiet in classroom settings. She wore pink corduroy pants, a purple turtleneck sweater, a puffy winter coat with a hood, and small boots with Velcro straps, and she carried a paper bag containing the clay sculpture she'd made during art class. Hannah had attended the art fair with her grandmother Patricia Cole, a 62-year-old retired librarian who lived 3 blocks from the school and frequently picked Hannah up from activities when her parents were working. Hannah's parents, Michael and Jennifer Cole, both worked at IBM in Burlington, about 15 miles from Williston, and they'd asked Patricia to take Hannah to the art fair because they couldn't leave work early. The art fair ended at 3 p.m., and Patricia and Hannah left the school together at approximately 3:20 p.m., walking hand in hand toward Patricia's house on Elm Street, where Hannah would stay until her parents picked her up after work. The route from school to Patricia's house was a straightforward walk, left out of the school parking lot, 2 blocks down Maple Avenue, then right onto Elm Street for 1 more block to Patricia's yellow 2-story house. It was a walk they'd made dozens of times before, through a quiet residential neighborhood where families knew each other, and children played safely in yards and on sidewalks. At approximately 3:35 p.m., Patricia and Hannah were walking along Maple Avenue when Patricia realized she'd left her purse in the school gymnasium, and she'd need it, because it contained her house keys and medication. "Hannah, sweetheart, Grandma forgot her purse," Patricia said, stopping on the sidewalk about halfway between the school and her house. "We need to go back and get it." Hannah was tired from the busy afternoon and starting to get cold in the November chill, and she asked if she could wait on the bench outside Henderson's hardware store, which was visible just ahead on the corner. The hardware store was a Williston fixture owned by George Henderson, and it had a wooden bench outside where people often sat, and Patricia could see it clearly from where they stood. "Stay right on that bench," Patricia instructed firmly. "Don't move from that spot. I'll run back to the school and be back in 5 minutes, okay? Don't talk to anyone and don't go anywhere." Hannah nodded and walked the remaining 20 yards to the bench, sitting down with her paper bag of artwork beside her, and Patricia watched her settle onto the bench before turning back toward the school. Patricia speed-walked back to Maple Ridge Elementary, retrieved her purse from the gymnasium where she'd left it on a chair, and hurried back toward Henderson's hardware store, the entire round trip taking approximately 7 or 8 minutes. When Patricia returned to the hardware store at approximately 3:43 p.m., the bench was empty, Hannah was gone, and the paper bag with her clay sculpture sat alone on the wooden slats. Patricia's first reaction was confusion rather than panic, thinking Hannah had perhaps gone inside the hardware store to use the bathroom, or had walked down the block despite being told to stay put. She checked inside Henderson's hardware, asking George if he'd seen Hannah come in, and George said he'd been in the back storeroom for the past 10 minutes and hadn't seen the little girl. Patricia ran back outside and began calling Hannah's name, checking the sidewalk in both directions and looking between parked cars, and within minutes her confusion had transformed into terror. By 3:50 p.m., Patricia was screaming for help, and other residents were coming out of shops and homes asking what was wrong, and soon a dozen people were searching the immediate area calling Hannah's name. In approximately 8 minutes, while sitting on a bench on a busy street corner in a small Vermont town, 6-year-old Hannah Cole vanished without anyone seeing or hearing what happened to her. If you want to hear how DNA finally solved this heartbreaking mystery, make sure you're subscribed, hit that like button, and comment where you're watching from. Now let's continue the story. Williston police were called at 3:55 p.m., and Officer David Martinez arrived within minutes to find Patricia Cole hysterical with guilt, believing she'd failed her granddaughter by leaving her alone for those critical minutes. Officer Martinez immediately radioed for additional units and began coordinating a search of the surrounding blocks, asking residents if they'd seen a 6-year-old girl in a purple turtleneck and pink pants. George Henderson was interviewed about what he'd observed from the hardware store, and he explained that he'd been in the back inventory room between 3:30 and 3:45 p.m., so he hadn't seen Hannah sitting on the bench or noticed when she'd disappeared. The bench itself was examined, and the paper bag with Hannah's clay sculpture was collected as evidence. though it provided no clues about where the child had gone or who might have taken her. By 4:30 p.m., over 50 people were searching Williston's downtown area, checking inside every business and knocking on doors asking if anyone had seen Hannah or noticed suspicious activity around 3:40 p.m. Michael and Jennifer Cole received the call at their IBM offices that their daughter was missing, and they raced to Williston in separate cars, arriving by 5 p.m. to find their neighborhood transformed into a search zone. Vermont State Police arrived at 5:15 p.m., and Detective Sarah Thompson took over coordination of what was rapidly becoming a potential abduction investigation, given the circumstances and brief time frame. Detective Thompson interviewed Patricia extensively about the exact timeline and whether she'd seen anyone unusual on Maple Avenue or near the hardware store before leaving Hannah on the bench. There were a few cars parked on the street, Patricia recalled through tears, but I didn't pay attention to them. I was focused on getting back to school quickly so Hannah wouldn't be alone long. Residents who lived near Henderson's Hardware were interviewed about what they'd seen or heard around 3:40 p.m., and several reported seeing a young girl on the bench, but nobody had witnessed her leaving or being approached by anyone. One neighbor, Margaret Wilson, mentioned that she'd noticed a white conversion van parked across from the hardware store around 3:30 p.m., and she'd thought it odd because it had out-of-state plates, though she couldn't remember which state. The van was still there when I looked out my window at 3:45, Margaret explained, but when I checked again at 4 after hearing the commotion, it was gone. This information about the white van became the investigation's primary lead, and police immediately issued alerts for law enforcement across Vermont and neighboring states to watch for white conversion vans, particularly those with out-of-state registration. The description was frustratingly vague. White conversion van, possibly from the early 1980s, unknown make or model, plates from an unidentified state, no other distinguishing features that witnesses could recall. Detective Thompson theorized that someone in the van had been watching and waiting, and when Patricia left Hannah alone on the bench, they'd grabbed the child quickly and driven away before anyone noticed. But this theory raised questions about whether it was opportunistic crime by someone who happened to be there, or if Hannah had been targeted specifically and the perpetrator had been following her. Hannah's parents insisted they knew of no one who would want to harm their daughter. No custody disputes, no concerning interactions with strangers, nothing that would make Hannah a specific target. Bloodhounds were brought in from Burlington and given Hannah's scent from clothing at her grandparents' house, and the dogs tracked from the bench to the street where the scent ended, suggesting she'd been placed in a vehicle. By nightfall on November 3rd, the search had expanded to cover a 20-mile radius from Williston, with volunteers checking wooded areas and abandoned buildings where a child might have been taken. FBI Special Agent Robert Chen arrived from the Boston field office on Sunday morning and brought resources for what was now officially being treated as a child abduction under federal jurisdiction. Agent Chen focused investigation on registered sex offenders in Vermont and surrounding states, checking alibis and backgrounds for anyone who might have been in Williston on Saturday afternoon. One man named Thomas Parker, who lived in New Hampshire, raised initial flags because he'd been convicted of child endangerment in 1979, and he drove a white van for his plumbing business. Parker was interviewed extensively and his van was processed forensically, but he had witnesses confirming he'd been working at a job site in New Hampshire during the time Hannah disappeared, and he was eventually cleared. The case generated intense media coverage across New England, with Hannah's photo appearing on television and in newspapers, and her distinctive blonde bob and shy smile became an image everyone in the region recognized. Tips flooded in from people claiming to have seen Hannah at rest stops and shopping centers across Vermont, New Hampshire, and surrounding states, but every reported sighting was investigated and found to be other children. Michael and Jennifer appeared on local news programs pleading for Hannah's return, with Jennifer barely able to speak through her grief, and Michael begging whoever had taken their daughter to let her go. Hannah has epilepsy, Michael told cameras. She needs her medication twice daily or she could have seizures. Please, if you have her, she needs medical care. Just let her go somewhere safe. The mention of Hannah's medical condition added urgency to the search because without her medication, she could be in serious danger beyond the trauma of abduction itself. Patricia Cole was hospitalized briefly for severe anxiety and guilt, blaming herself for the decision to leave Hannah alone, even for those few minutes, and she required sedation to cope with the overwhelming trauma. By mid-November, the intensive daily search operations had been scaled back after 2 weeks produced no trace of Hannah, despite thousands of volunteer hours and extensive law enforcement investigation. The white conversion van was never identified despite massive efforts to track down matching vehicles, and investigators began to suspect the description might have been inaccurate, or the van had come from far outside the region. The years passed with unbearable slowness for the Cole family, with 1984 becoming 1990 and then 2000, and Hannah's bedroom remained exactly as she'd left it the morning she'd gone to the art fair with her grandmother. Patricia Cole never forgave herself for leaving Hannah alone on that bench, and she died in 1998 at age 76, with guilt being cited by family as a contributing factor to her declining health. Michael and Jennifer's marriage survived the tragedy, though it was forever changed, both understanding that separating would mean losing the only other person who understood the depth of their loss. They became advocates for child safety legislation, working with lawmakers to create Hannah's Law, requiring businesses in Vermont to install security cameras in public areas, reforms that came too late for their daughter. Age progression photos were created showing what Hannah might look like at 10, then 16, then 25, and these images were distributed through missing persons databases, though the family knew she'd likely died in 1984. Detective James Morrison took over the cold case in 2005, and he periodically reviewed the evidence, hoping that advancing technology might reveal something investigators in 1984 had missed. Morrison tracked down the white conversion van lead extensively, checking vehicle registrations and interviewing people who'd owned such vans in 1984, but the investigation produced no viable suspects after hundreds of hours of work. By 2015, Hannah would have been 37 years old, possibly with a career and family of her own, and her parents held memorial services on each November 3rd anniversary, though they'd never had a body to bury. True crime podcasts discovered Hannah's case in the late 2010s, and several shows featured episodes analyzing the brief window when she'd disappeared and proposing theories about the white van and its driver. In March 2024, construction workers demolishing an old motel on Route 2 near Montpelier, about 25 miles from Williston, made a disturbing discovery while tearing down a wall in one of the ground floor rooms. Behind drywall that had been installed sometime in the mid-1980s, workers found human remains of what appeared to be a small child, wrapped in a deteriorated blanket and hidden in the wall cavity. Vermont State Police were called immediately, and Detective Sarah Chen from the cold case unit arrived to investigate what was clearly a homicide scene that had been concealed for decades. The remains were carefully extracted and transported to the State Forensic Laboratory, and preliminary examination suggested they'd been there for approximately 40 years, based on deterioration patterns and the construction timeline of the wall. Chen immediately thought of Hannah Cole's case given the age of the remains and the proximity to Williston, though Montpelier was far enough away that searchers in 1984 might not have focused intensive efforts there. The motel, called the Mountain View Inn, had been a struggling budget establishment in the 1980s and had changed ownership several times before finally closing in 2010 and sitting abandoned until scheduled for demolition. Chen requested that DNA be extracted from the remains and compared against Hannah Cole's genetic profile, which had been established years earlier using DNA from Michael and Jennifer. The forensic analysis took 6 weeks because the remains were significantly degraded, but scientists were able to recover sufficient genetic material for comparison against the Cole family's DNA. Michael and Jennifer, now in their 60s, received a call from Detective Chen in May 2024, asking them to come to the police station for an update on Hannah's case. "We've found remains that might be Hannah," Chen explained carefully. "DNA testing is underway and we should have results within a week, and I wanted you to hear this directly from me rather than through media reports." The wait for DNA results was agonizing, 40 years of not knowing potentially coming to an end, and the Coles prepared themselves emotionally for confirmation of what they'd always suspected. When results came back in early June 2024, they showed a 99.97% probability that the remains found in the motel wall were Hannah Cole, missing since November 1984 when she'd sat on a bench outside a hardware store. The confirmation that Hannah had been found brought overwhelming grief mixed with relief, and Michael and Jennifer held each other sobbing in Detective Chen's office, finally knowing where their daughter had been for 40 years. Chen's investigation revealed that the Mountain View Inn had been owned in 1984 by a man named Leonard Walsh, who'd operated the motel with his wife until selling it in 1987 and moving to Florida. Walsh had died in 2015, but Chen obtained warrants to exhume his body for DNA comparison against evidence collected from the motel room where Hannah's remains had been hidden. The renovation records showed that room 12, where the remains were found, had been extensively remodeled in December 1984, with new drywall installed throughout, creating the perfect opportunity to conceal a body. The exhumation of Leonard Walsh's body and subsequent DNA analysis took 8 weeks, and the results came back in August 2024, with findings that shocked investigators and transformed the case. DNA found on the deteriorated blanket that had wrapped Hannah's remains matched Leonard Walsh's genetic profile with 99.9% certainty, providing conclusive evidence that he'd been in contact with the victim. Further forensic examination of the remains revealed that Hannah had died from blunt force trauma to the head, and investigators theorized that Walsh had struck her during the abduction and she died quickly. Detective Chen investigated Walsh's background extensively and discovered a disturbing history that had never been connected to Hannah's disappearance, despite him living just 25 miles from Williston. Walsh had been investigated in 1979 for inappropriate conduct involving a young girl at his motel, but the case had been dropped when the family declined to press charges, and the incident had never been widely reported. Former employees at the Mountain View Inn were tracked down and interviewed about Walsh's behavior, and several recalled that he'd been controlling and paranoid, often doing maintenance work alone, without allowing staff into certain rooms. One former housekeeper named Dorothy Martinez, now 78, remembered November 1984 specifically because Walsh had told staff that room 12 was off limits for cleaning and he was doing renovations himself. He put a do not disturb sign on that room and told us he was remodeling, Dorothy recalled. It stayed closed for about 3 weeks, and when he finally reopened it, the walls were all fresh with new drywall and paint. This timeline aligned perfectly with Hannah's disappearance on November 3rd and the subsequent wall installation that had concealed her remains for 40 years. Chen theorized that Walsh had been in Williston on November 3rd for unknown reasons, had seen Hannah sitting alone on the bench, and had grabbed her in a moment of opportunity. He'd driven her to his motel about 25 miles away, and at some point during the abduction, Hannah had been fatally injured, either through violence or accident during struggle. Rather than report what happened or seek help, Walsh had hidden Hannah's body in his motel and then concealed the evidence by installing new drywall in room 12 within weeks of her death. Walsh's wife Eleanor, who'd co-owned the motel, had died in 2008, but her sister was interviewed and revealed that Eleanor had suspected Leonard of something terrible, but had been too afraid of him to investigate or report. Eleanor told me once that Leonard had become paranoid and secretive in late 1984, the sister recalled. She said he'd started drinking heavily and seemed haunted by something, but when she asked what was wrong, he'd become violent, and she stopped questioning him. The white conversion van that witnesses had reported seeing near Henderson's hardware store was tracked through old DMV records to Leonard Walsh, who'd owned a 1982 Dodge Ram van registered in Vermont. The van had been sold in 1985 to a buyer in Massachusetts, and tracking it through subsequent owners led to a junkyard in Maine where it had been scrapped in 1993, eliminating any possibility of forensic analysis. But the registration and witness descriptions matched, confirming that Walsh had been in Williston that day and had used his van to transport Hannah to the motel where she'd died. Michael and Jennifer Cole received the full investigation results in September 2024, and while they were devastated to learn the details of Hannah's final hours, they were grateful to finally have answers after 40 years. We always wondered if she'd suffered, if she'd been scared for a long time, if she'd called for us, Jennifer said through tears. Knowing it was quick doesn't make it better, but at least we know she didn't endure prolonged torture. The fact that Leonard Walsh had died in 2015 without ever being held accountable for Hannah's murder was bitter, but the family found some solace in his identity being publicly revealed and his reputation destroyed. Everyone who knew Leonard Walsh will now know he was a child killer, Michael stated. He died thinking he'd gotten away with it, but his name will forever be associated with what he did to Hannah. Detective Chen's investigation revealed that Walsh had been deeply in debt in 1984 and under stress from the failing motel business, and the abduction appeared to have been impulsive rather than planned. He was at the wrong place at the wrong time, saw an opportunity when that little girl was alone, and made a decision that destroyed multiple lives, including eventually his own, Chen explained. The case brought renewed attention to the importance of thoroughly investigating anyone with access to children, even those with businesses that seem legitimate, because predators often hide in plain sight. And it demonstrated that bodies can be hidden in unexpected places, remaining undiscovered for decades until construction or renovation finally reveals the secrets walls have kept. Hannah Cole was finally laid to rest in October 2024, 40 years after she disappeared from a bench outside a hardware store, and over 500 people attended the funeral service in Williston. The small casket was carried by family members who'd never stopped searching for Hannah, and the service celebrated both the little girl she'd been and the woman she would have become if Leonard Walsh hadn't stolen her life. Michael Cole, now 68, spoke at the service about the 40 years of not knowing that had been almost worse than knowing the truth, and about the strange mix of grief and relief that came with finally bringing Hannah home. "We lived in limbo for 4 decades, Michael said, every day wondering if this would be the day we got answers, and now that we have them, we can finally grieve properly and let Hannah rest in peace." Jennifer Cole, now 66, placed Hannah's clay sculpture from the art fair, which had been preserved as evidence for 40 years, in the casket beside her daughter as a connection to that final day they'd spent together. The sculpture, a small clay bird that 6-year-old Hannah had painted blue and yellow, had survived decades in storage and now would rest with her forever, a tangible reminder of her creativity and innocence. Patricia Cole, who died in 1998 carrying guilt for leaving Hannah alone, was finally able to receive posthumous peace, as family members explained that Leonard Walsh had been a predator who would have found another opportunity, if not that day. Grandma Patricia blamed herself for 40 years until she died, Hannah's cousin spoke at the service. But we know now that a dangerous man was hunting, and nothing Grandma did caused this except being unlucky enough to need her purse that day. The case resolution made national headlines as an example of how construction and renovation projects can unexpectedly solve cold cases, and it prompted other jurisdictions to be vigilant when demolishing old buildings. Detective Chen used Hannah's case in training seminars for law enforcement, emphasizing that bodies can be hidden in walls, under floors, and in structural spaces that may not be discovered for decades until buildings are demolished. The Mountain View Inn property was purchased by Williston after demolition, and the town voted to create a memorial park on the site in Hannah's honor, transforming the place where she'd been hidden into a space, celebrating her memory. The park includes a playground with a bench inscribed with Hannah's name, and families gather there knowing the space represents both tragedy and the determination to never forget children who've been lost to violence. Vermont passed legislation in 2024 requiring DNA testing of all unidentified remains within 90 days of discovery, reforms inspired by the 40-year delay in identifying Hannah and named Hannah Cole's Law in her memory. The law also mandates that construction companies report any human remains found during demolition or renovation immediately to law enforcement, creating protocols that didn't exist when Hannah's remains were discovered by chance. Michael and Jennifer established a foundation supporting families of long-term missing children, providing resources for DNA testing and age progression photos, and funding the kind of searches they'd conducted for Hannah over 4 decades. "We want something good to come from Hannah's death," Jennifer told reporters. "If our foundation can help even one family find their missing child faster than 40 years, then Hannah's memory will have made a difference." The case brought closure to a Vermont community that had carried the weight of Hannah's disappearance for 4 decades, and residents who'd been children in 1984 attended her funeral as adults who'd never forgotten the little girl who'd vanished. Former classmates who were now in their mid-40s remembered Hannah as quiet and kind, and they planted a tree at Maple Ridge Elementary in her memory, ensuring current students would learn her story. The bench outside Henderson's hardware store where Hannah had sat for the last minutes of her life was replaced with a new bench bearing a plaque, "In memory of Hannah Cole, 1978-1984, forever 6 years old, never forgotten." George Henderson, now 92, attended Hannah's funeral and spoke about his regret at being in the storeroom during those critical minutes when he might have seen something that could have helped. "I've thought about that day every single day for 40 years, George said with tears, wondering if I'd been at the counter instead of in back. Would I have seen something? Could I have stopped it? But we'll never know. The resolution of Hannah's case proved that advances in DNA technology can solve even the oldest cold cases, and that construction projects can unexpectedly reveal secrets that have been hidden for decades in walls and foundations. It demonstrated the importance of preserving DNA samples from missing persons and their families, because decades may pass before remains are discovered, and technology exists to make identifications. And it showed that perpetrators who believe they've successfully hidden their crimes may die thinking they escaped justice, but the truth can emerge long after they're gone, destroying their legacies and providing closure to families. Michael and Jennifer Cole visit Hannah's grave weekly, finally able to talk to their daughter at a specific place rather than wondering where in the world she might be, and they find peace in knowing she's home. For 40 years we didn't know if Hannah was alive somewhere suffering or if she was dead where her body was, Michael said at the 1-year anniversary of her burial. Now we know she's here, she's at peace, and we can visit her. The story of Hannah Cole reminds us that 6-year-olds should be safe sitting on benches in small towns, that predators can hide behind legitimate businesses, and that families deserve answers no matter how much time has passed. And in Williston, Vermont, where a little girl in a purple turtleneck once sat waiting for her grandmother, her memory lives on in laws that protect children, in a park that celebrates her life, and in a community that never gave up searching. The case stands as testament to determined investigation, the power of DNA technology, the reality that construction can solve mysteries, and the truth that even after 40 years, the lost can be found and brought home. Hannah Cole was lost in 1984, hidden in a wall for 40 years, found in 2024 through demolition and DNA, and finally laid to rest surrounded by family and a community that had never forgotten her.